Hello, everyone. Rachel Weaver here. I am on faculty and staff at Lighthouse Writers Workshop. I've been putting together a series of videos called The Story of a Book, in which I ask authors to tell us a little bit about how their book came to be in the world. So today we have with us Kelsey Freeman. Thanks for being with us, Kelsey.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Kelsey has a new book out, her first book. It's a book of nonfiction called No Option But the Truth, The Migrant World and the Perilous Path Across the Border. This book is based on a year that Kelsey spent interviewing Central American migrants as they journeyed through Mexico. It just came out April 14th of this year with IG Publishing. So Kelsey, I'll turn it over to you and let you tell us a little bit about the writing and publishing of this book.
Yeah, so this book came to be, really it goes back to a moment that I talk about in the book, and that I write about or share in interviews. And when I was 22 years old, I was traveling in southern Mexico. I was doing research for my undergraduate thesis, which focused on indigenous rights, indigenous social movements, but I was seeing how intertwined indigenous rights in Mexico are with migration as I was seeing people heading north. Then I had this conversation with the man next to me on the bus who had been deported from California, and he asked me straight out, how is it that you can come to my country and study my people for 2 weeks while I've been repeatedly denied for a visa to go back and visit my family in your country? And that to me cut to the heart of it. And I didn't have a good answer for him at the time, but the question stuck with me and it caused me to want to go back to Mexico and dig deeper into that question. How is it that race and class and nationality matter when it comes to who gets to go to the US legally and who takes on an illicit, perilous journey through Mexico and across the border? So then I applied for a Fulbright fellowship. I went back to central Mexico and I spent about a year living in an industrial city of Celaya. I was teaching English and then I was also studying migration. So I spent my evenings in the local migrant shelter. I had conversations with hundreds of migrants coming through and then did more formalized interviews with dozens of people about the reasons that they were going north, about what their journey north had entailed thus far. And what I came to see, I didn't go in with the idea that I was going to write a book. I went in with the idea that I would write and I would collect stories, and I thought maybe I'd go back to my hometown, go back to Carbondale where I mostly grew up, and do like a story exhibit or something like that. But the more I interviewed and the more I wrote, the more pieces there were to this puzzle of migration. And then I suddenly had enough to kind of start treating it as a book. And so I started approaching it that way, organizing my ideas that way, and started really digging into this question of what does it mean to migrate by necessity? When people have no other options, what risks and what dangers do they take on in order to find hope and in order to search for something better? I think the stories in the book are difficult. It's not a light read, but I think it's a necessary one. So I try to, No Option But North, my book, I try to dig into not only the stories and what people have experienced thus far, migrants have experienced, but also the more structural issues, the policies and practices that render their stories possible in the first place. I spent a year interviewing, I spent a year writing, and I had a bunch of vignettes of short kind of stories of migrant experiences. So then my fellowship ended. I came back to the US. I moved to Oregon. And I spent another year working and writing when I could. I did a lot of research, again, into policy, a lot of trying to connect the lived realities of what I had seen with the structural issues. And then after a year, I finished a draft manuscript, and I was, determined to get it out there in some way. I knew that it would not be easy. I'm young, I'm previously unpublished, I hadn't published anything, articles or anything before. But I felt that the stories were worthwhile, and I felt that they would find a home. So I began pitching agents, I began pitching publishers. I did a lot of kind of trying to figure out the publishing process as I went. And I got a lot of guidance along the way, which was really helpful. And I think I expected a lot of rejection and mostly rejection. And so when that came my way, I wasn't surprised by it or deterred by it. Anyway, so then the book found a home with IG Publishing, which has been great because they do have this focus on kind of political nonfiction, at least with many of their books. And so it has been, again, learning a lot about the publishing process, asking a lot of questions of Robert at IG, and trying to figure out a lot as I go. And then, of course, the pandemic has thrown a wrench in that as well, for even those who are very experienced with this process. So I feel very grateful in that I've gotten to have a lot of conversations about migration, and use the book as a vehicle to dig into some of the issues. So it's been a very cool process. I feel very grateful to be able to share this.
A couple things, a couple questions that I have after listening to you. First, I have to apologize. I said the name of your book incorrectly at first. No Option But North.
Oh, no.
And do you have it?
Yeah, I have it. No Option But North. The Migrant World and the Perilous Path Across the Border.
Mm-hmm. So a couple things I'm interested in, or that I thought of as you were talking. The first is this idea of, first and foremost, following a curiosity, right? So this man on a bus asks you a question, and your mind just keeps turning it over. And I think it's very interesting that you followed it, right? I think a lot of times we dismiss those curiosities in our lives, because we have to do all these other things that we think we have to do, right? So I think that is super interesting. I think that is a part of ourselves as writers that should be cultivated, keeping our minds open, recognizing when something kind of gets its hooks in us, and then following it, and without knowing where it's going or what will happen. So that was one of the first things I was thinking about. And then second of all, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about writing about such a hotly contested subject matter. What was that like, and what has that been like for you to join that conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple of thoughts in terms of writing about immigration. First of all, when I was in Mexico, it was 2016, 2017, so before the 2016 election, and then immediately afterward, and after President Trump's inauguration. So everyone I was talking to, migrants and just, Mexican citizens, were asking me about what might change under the Trump administration. There was a lot of fear coursing through migrants that were going north about what might happen, what might not happen. So I tried to, in my conversations with migrants, kind of sift through the policy and sift through fears of what might change. I felt like that was a useful role that I could have. And I think it helped me develop a more comfortable space where migrants then could share their thoughts. And it was more of a conversation that then led to deeper, more formalized interviews often. But building that space of confidence was really important for me. But then as immigration has continued to be such a key topic right now, and it has been for decades for so many people, but in terms of our national discourse, I think it's caused me to think a lot about what is my role in sharing these stories, especially as a white person, especially as someone who, you know, isn't necessarily directly touched by immigration policies. I think it's caused me to think a lot about how is this useful? How does this advance the conversation? And I think what it has come down to for me is that it's not my role to speak for people or share people's stories as if, you know, like we hear sometimes, give voice to the voiceless, right? As if people or migrants don't have their own voices and haven't already shared their stories in really valuable ways. So I don't see that as my role. Rather, I see my role as someone who can give voice to the structural injustices and inadequacies that I see, and that I think create or exacerbate these stories, and you know, cause a hungering man to walk thousands of miles and take a train that was never meant for passengers and risk his life. So I think it's caused me to think about what's useful in sharing this book, what can my role be, and how can I continue to have conversations without speaking for people. I think that's been a very important part of this process as well.
Mm-hmm. The final question that I have for you is about the logistics of finding IG. IG Publishing is a small or a mid-sized press out of Brooklyn. And I wonder if you said that you were sending your manuscript to small publishing houses and agents. Did you find IG through an agent, or did you find IG on your own as a writer?
Yeah, well, I started, mostly sending my work to agents, but again, I was, 23 and 24 when I started pitching, and I figured that probably would not work. So then I moved on to looking for small presses. I think small presses are wonderful and can fill such a cool role in the publishing arena. So I was looking for small presses that had kind of a political focus or social justice focus. I really just, I got the advice to go back and dig through books that I had read, books I felt had a similar scope or focus to mine, and look for publishers that way. So that, I think it was the book American Apartheid that IG had published that I found, and then I looked them up and submitted a query letter and got in conversation with Robert that way. So really I found myself getting sucked down internet holes way too often of going from one publisher to another and just Google, and that wasn't always that helpful for me. So going back to books was really the best way for me to find a publisher.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kelsey, for sharing your story, and congratulations on the publication of your book.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Rachel, for chatting with me.